Hey guys, it's Celestia, and I really like horror. It's been my favorite genre of media since I was far too young to be consuming it. And whether it's in the form of movies, shows, games, or videos online, pretty much all of my free time is spent watching or playing something horror related. Even outside of my free time, horror shows and movies and videos are always playing in the background while I'm working or exercising. Everything from Loey Lane's Scary Side of TikTok compilations to the newest Mike Flanagan Netflix original series to rewatching Repo the Genetic Opera for the 30th time. And that's why recently, when our Lord and Savior Wendigoon posted a new video discussing 2 new analog horror series, I watched it immediately. To my surprise, one of the 2 presented a concept that I, as an artist, found uniquely intriguing. A series of lost police tapes following a killer that left behind unique paintings of their victims based on the way they died. That already hooked me. Combining art and horror, my 2 favorite things, I am so very here for that. But when I learned that the series was created by an artist with the primary purpose of utilizing the analog horror format to showcase their art, I was even more intrigued, because that's not something I'd seen done before, at least in video format, and it's something that I'd be very interested to do myself. And this promising series was The Painter. But as I watched more and more of Wendigoon's video, it became abundantly clear that The Painter not only failed to deliver a particularly good execution of that very interesting concept, but was also deeply involved in a lot of controversy surrounding not only the project's quality, but its creator's actions and the very morality of the series itself. So I dug into it more, and more, and more, and realized that while a lot of the criticisms both the series and the creator are facing are fairly straightforward, others prompt a valuable discussion surrounding the ethics of art, and we all know I love talking about that. Ethics are not, by very nature, quantifiably measurable. We cannot factually assert whether something is right or wrong, because right and wrong don't have universal definitions. We all have differing individual definitions that we invent and establish based on our own perspectives and experiences, meaning that what's wrong or right for me may very well not be for you. Yes, there are many things that are widely agreed upon to be right or wrong. I could say kicking puppies is bad and probably have very few people disagreeing in the comments. But they could disagree, because without universal definitions for right and wrong, kicking puppies being bad is just an opinion, regardless of how many people agree with it. Subsequently, any discussion surrounding art and ethics is going to be rife with nuance, disagreement, and ultimately opinions. Opinions that I think it's important to talk about. I've made several videos discussing the ethics of depicting dark themes in art. Vent art, pro-shipping, I've gone over each in depth in terms of whether or not I believe them to be ethical, and asserted that, in my opinion, it boils down to assessing on an individual basis whether or not the art is actively harming anyone, and whether or not the artist creating it intended it to. Some would argue that if the art is doing harm, it doesn't matter whether or not the artist intended it to, but I personally believe that the artist shouldn't be held responsible for their work doing harm by being misinterpreted, so long as they didn't present it in a manner that encouraged that misinterpretation. Effectively, I believe that it's fine to depict bad things in art so long as they're presented as bad. Toxic relationships, violence, even truly horrendous acts have a right to be depicted so long as they're depicted as bad. Even if the art inadvertently normalizes those things or influences the viewer's beliefs on them in a less than ideal way, the artist can't be held responsible for that, in my opinion, so long as they did their due diligence to present their work in a way that actively discouraged that outcome. Art is a form of expression, and sometimes its goal is to repulse. Terrible things do happen in life, and art depicting it is valuable as a way to express that. But when we draw those terrible things, I believe that we can only do so ethically by drawing them in a way that aims to repel the viewer, to elicit a negative response, to scare them, to repulse them, to perturb them, to reinforce that what they're seeing is wrong. The problem arises when those terrible things are drawn in a way that either minimizes how terrible they are, or even suggests that they aren't, exploiting them or even promoting them. And that brings me back to The Painter, and the reason that I'm making this video in the first place. I do believe that there are things too dark to be ethically drawn, but with the exception of art that deliberately as children, I don't believe that those things are determined by what they are, but rather the artist's intentions in drawing them. The Painter forces us to ask whether or not the themes it depicts are quite simply crossing the line, and in my opinion, the answer must then be found by assessing how its creator intended it to be perceived, and the manner in which they presented it. The problem is that the creator makes that very, very difficult. In today's video, we're going to break down the many controversies surrounding both The Painter and its creator, UrbanSPOOK, and hopefully conclude whether or not this artist did indeed take their work too far. But first, a disclaimer. The Painter as a series details incredibly graphic violence and murder, includes disturbing imagery, and most controversially, includes narrative mentions of CSA, although without obvious accompanying visuals. I will not be going into detail about any of the violence in particular, and the only images I will be including are some of the paintings that are not too graphic. But by nature of the subject matter, there will be significant discussion surrounding CSA and whether or not its depiction within the series is unethical and exploitative. The speed paint in the background of the video video will also depict mild gore, but only in the form of a cute anime girl with a partially exposed brain. If any of that will be upsetting or triggering for you to hear about or see, this is not the video for you. There will also be mild spoilers as to the plot of The Painter, so please be aware of that as well. And I'm sorry in advance for all of the censoring I'm gonna have to do to not get demonetized. Blame YouTube, not me. Now, to address every aspect of this controversy, I'm gonna break this down into 3 sections. The problems people have with the story itself, the problems people have with the morality of CSA being depicted in the series, and the general morality of depicting dark themes in art, and the controversy surrounding the creators' actions and response to the criticisms that they're facing. But before we start, let me give you a quick rundown on what The Painter actually is. Also, one quick note. I've heard people call The Painter UrbanSPOOK, or call the creator UrbanSPOOK. To my understanding, both are wrong. The series is called The Painter, the channel it's posted to is called UrbanSPOOK, and the creator goes by the name Urban Slug, just for clarification's sake. Now, the basic premise of The Painter is that the owner of the channel, UrbanSPOOK, found a series of police tapes in the basement of his apartment complex and is posting them online as he converts them to a digital format. The tapes, now in the form of YouTube videos, narrate a police investigation into a series of brutal murders in which a killer, or two, as we later learn, is killing a multitude of victims in an increasingly graphic manner, only to leave paintings of those victims inspired by the manner in which they were killed behind. That premise alone is so interesting to me, and at least artistically, it's very well executed. The paintings themselves do an exceptional job at incorporating the victims' manners of death into the killer's perception and subsequent interpretation of them in an incredibly creative manner. The art itself is amazing and often truly disturbing. I watched the whole series, which currently consists of 8 relatively short videos, and while I didn't find the story itself particularly interesting or scary beyond the initial premise itself, I was consistently impressed and unsettled by the art. There were points in watching it where my wife would glance over at what was on my screen and just deadpan voice, horrified face, stop what she was doing and ask, "What is that?" And that's not an unwarranted response. The illustrations are undoubtedly the project's biggest strength, something that even its harshest critics acknowledge. It actually inspired me to go back and find my own old horror art and redraw some of it, one instance of which you're seeing in the speed paint behind me now. Plot-wise, however, as of scripting, The Painter has presented very little beyond simply documenting the work of these serial killers and their paintings, and no meaningful progress has yet been made to establish their identities or motivations. And that leads me to the first and most straightforward controversy surrounding The Painter, that the story itself is just not good. This aspect is not one that I want to dwell on for too long, simply because there are plenty of other videos that analyze the series as a whole with a focus on its narrative and its technical execution, like the Wendigoon video that I mentioned earlier that's linked in the card above. But I will summarize it as well as bring up one under-discussed problem with how its quality is being assessed in the first place. The controversy surrounding the series' quality as a piece of analog horror media itself is quite simple. It basically comes down to the fact that both The Painter's story and manner of storytelling are exceptionally weak. Each upload follows the exact same formula. Text tells you that this person went to this place, describes how they were subsequently brutally murdered there in graphic detail, shows you the photos from the crime scene, and shows you the paintings based on the victims that police found at the crime scene that the killers left behind. The method of storytelling is lazy and predictable, and the plot doesn't appear thus far to be much deeper than just following a series of very violent unsolved murders with no meaningful progress being made towards catching those responsible, establishing why they're doing this, or even introducing any well-defined recurring characters other than the killers. Characters are barely even introduced before they're killed off, giving us no time to care about them and subsequently be upset that they died. The focus is instead only on how they died, and many find that the manner of death is vastly less scary when the character dying means nothing to us as viewers because we couldn't connect with them. The most interesting element is seeing how the killers artistically interpret their victims' manners of death in their portraits of them. And while that is admittedly very interesting, there's not much more to it than that. Narrative-wise, each upload presents nothing more than an attempt to one-up the last one in terms of how graphic and creative the deaths are, to the point that it's basically just gratuitous gore presented in exactly the same way every time, without any significant progress being made to advance the plot. And in that regard, I can agree with people's criticisms of it as a piece of analog horror. Beyond a few instances, like the infamous 911 call that was exceptionally well delivered, engaging, and genuinely upsetting, I found the series to be an awesome concept with an abysmally lazy, boring delivery. But what I feel is being unjustly and massively under-discussed is the fact that The Painter largely only fails when you compare it to other more traditional analog horror projects like Greylock, the Mandela Catalog, the Walton Files, and so on. In defense of Urban Slug, its creator, The Painter isn't trying to be like those projects. He made The Painter not to tell a story, but to showcase and promote his art. The story always came second, acting more as a delivery vehicle for his art than a primary priority. The story isn't what you're supposed to focus on, the art is. The story exists only to support and enhance the art, whereas in the majority of analog horror as we understand it today, it's the other way around. Most analog analog horror projects have a story they want to tell, and then they create the visuals to tell it. But the painter has art that it's only creating a story to present, so of course it's going to fail in comparison. When we look at an analog horror series with subpar visuals, we're more forgiving of that if the story is incredibly compelling and interesting, because that's the element that we collectively have come to value first and foremost within the genre of analog horror. When judging the painter, I believe that we should reject that approach, because that's quite simply not what the project was made to achieve. In this case, we should reverse it. We should be more forgiving of a subpar story because of the exceptional quality of the art, since that's the element that it's made to place value on. Within horror films, we have subgenres: psychological, dystopian, crime, paranormal, slasher, and so on. When we judge the quality of a horror movie, we generally don't do so compared to all other horror movies, but all other horror movies within the same subgenre, because elements that are typical of one may not be at all present in another. For example, you wouldn't compare The Sixth Sense to Silence of the Lambs and subsequently criticize Silence of the Lambs for not having any supernatural elements, while The Sixth Sense did, because those elements aren't expected from the genre that Silence of the Lambs exists within. Similarly, and more relevantly, you wouldn't compare Scream to Midsommar and criticize Midsommar for not having enough gratuitous violence, nor Scream for not having enough deep, mysterious plot to unravel. Those are simply not elements expected from their respective genres. Now, you could say that one genre is better than the other, in your opinion, and criticize individual genres based on the elements that comprise the films that are made within them. But it becomes unfair and unreasonable to criticize those individual films within them simply for having those elements that are typical of them. It's fine to say you think slasher flicks are a subpar horror genre. It's not fine to say that Scream is a subpar movie just by nature of being a slasher flick. Scream is a very good slasher flick, you just don't like slasher flicks. Based on the criteria set out by that genre, many would say that it's the best version of what it is. You just don't like the type of thing it is. Originally, I was going to argue that Urban Slug shouldn't have labeled the series so clearly as analog horror in every video's title if he didn't want it compared to all of those other projects. But in examining this more closely, I actually think we should instead reconsider how we view analog horror as a whole. If we have subgenres of horror in which we're able to judge movies differently based on the different criteria making up each one, that allows us to judge them more fairly. It's like an umbrella. Within the entire genre of horror, there are some elements present in all subgenres that we can judge accurately by comparing any two films within it, like pacing, casting, sound design, visuals, and plot premise. But there are different criteria for critical analysis that are more specific to each subgenre, elements that can only benefit from comparison to other pieces of media under the same umbrella. I could compare Scream and Midsommar based on how good the visuals are, how well the music set the mood, how good of a job the actors did, but they benefit from being judged separately when it comes to other things like degree of violence, depth of plot, and what it aims to elicit in the viewer. Does it aim to make them jump in their seat with shock value and jump scares, or does it aim to get into their head with deep and disturbing concepts that keep them up at night? Urban Slug's inspiration for the painter was, according to him, 80s slasher flicks, and it shows. But because we've come to define analog horror as a psychological story-driven medium, the painter subsequently suffers from an unfavorable comparison that set it up to fail. To judge it for being gory and lacking deep plot neglects to acknowledge that gore and a lack of plot are typical elements within slasher flicks. We're comparing Scream to Midsommar rather than comparing Scream to Halloween, which is just unproductive and unfair. It would do us more good to expand analog horror as a genre to acknowledge subgenres within it, so that each individual project is judged by fairer, more accurate criteria. Now, am I saying the painter would be good when judged within a slasher subgenre of analog horror? In my opinion, no, I still think it falls dramatically short. I'd put it much closer to Hostel 2 than Scream, but that's based on criticisms I have with the pacing, the repetitive manner of storytelling, the predictability, and the fact that characters are killed before they're even introduced. Not because it's lacking in plot or has too much violence, both of which should be expected within that subgenre. And that's where I stand on the controversy surrounding the painter's quality as a piece of media. Now it's time to move on to the much more nuanced controversy, the morality. The painter is widely criticized for being exploitative due to the subject matter it depicts, and I don't mean the violence. Most people are relatively okay with the gratuitous violence beyond criticizing it as a lazy way to scare people, as we already addressed, because it's existed in media for about as long as media has existed. We understand that violence exists in life, so it should naturally have a right to be depicted in art, so long as it isn't depicted favorably. Real violence is scary, so of course a genre of media that's supposed to be scary is going to depict it. Horror exists to disturb us, so it's expected that it would include include elements that are, in reality, disturbing. This acceptance becomes more controversial when the violent acts depicted are sexual in nature, and even more so when the victims are children, because that takes the horror of violence and adds 2 entire new layers of depravity to it, something that many argue is just too far. Even so, these things do happen in reality, as revolting as it is to acknowledge, and most agree that artists and creators do, then, have the right to depict it in their work so long as they depict it as a bad thing, something that's supposed to horrify us, not appeal to us, and something that's presented in a way that communicates how bad of a thing it is, rather than minimizing its actual harm and reducing the impact of its severity. That's where people begin to take issue with the painter. While some argue that it shouldn't depict CSA at all, most are acknowledging that the depiction itself isn't the issue, but the manner in which it's depicted and the intention of the creator in including it at all. Amongst the many murder victims in The Painter is Corey, an 11-year-old boy who was the victim of sexual violence and, implicitly, CSA. Many argue that the way Urban Slug presented this was ethically irresponsible as an artist, because he effectively reduced CSA to just another way to one-up the graphic shock value. Urban Slug openly admits that he intentionally uses violence for simple shock value throughout the entire series, which we could excuse as simply an expected element of a slasher subgenre of horror, but that would mean, by extension, that he did intend to utilize CSA as nothing more than shock value alone, which many feel to be exploitative and disrespectful, not to mention just deeply unnecessary. The crass manner in which it was depicted also feels disrespectful and frankly gross, using the language you see here to refer to a child victim. One could argue that since that was the title that the killer within the story gave the painting of him, such terminology's use should be viewed as an extension of the killer's own depraved views, and that it's subsequently supposed to be gross and crass and disrespectful to show that the killer is gross and crass and disrespectful. Still, many argue that there are lines you simply don't cross, and that throwing CSA onto an art project that's based solely on shock value and gratuitous violence just to one-up the previous instance of violence is wrong. But how do we actually evaluate when the presentation of CSA crosses the line from acceptable and into the realm of disrespectful and exploitative? It's difficult, if not impossible, to answer that question, in my opinion, based on interpretation of the presentation alone. We also have to consider the artist's intentions, and this is where we get into what I mentioned earlier about Urban Slug making that incredibly difficult. See, judging Urban Slug's intentions when creating The Painter is no simple task, because he himself hasn't just been unclear about them, he's been outright contradictory. On Twitter, he's claimed on multiple occasions that he does not take the series seriously and is effectively just trolling with it, making statements like, "Guys, The Painter is a comedy," and "If you don't watch The Painter like a Mortal Kombat Fatality compilation, you're watching it wrong." But on Reddit, and even in the comments of Wendigoon's video criticizing the project, his responses have been rational, mature, and in complete acknowledgement of the project's shortcomings, making it very clear that he does put real effort into the project and aims to create something valuable with it. In his comment to Wendigoon, he says, "I have no idea where you've heard that I don't care about my series or that I make it only to sell shirts. That is not true. I made the first couple of episodes just for fun, but since it blew up, I really want to improve and try my hand at something new for each episode, like animation or voice acting." Now, I'm not sure why he's confused as to why people would think he doesn't care after how he's talked about the series on Twitter, but he does claim now to genuinely want to use the project as an opportunity to grow and experiment with new things. He also goes on to say the following: "Please don't take anything I do on Twitter seriously. A lot of people know me solely from Twitter by now, but I really only use that site to troll. I don't really care if anyone hates my work. I'm very aware that it's extreme and provocative." So perhaps since he views his behavior on Twitter as obviously trolling and separate from his actual views on the series, he assumes others will make the same distinction. They just haven't been, and rightfully so, I think. Side note, I definitely don't believe he doesn't care if people hate it based on the way he's lashed out at so many people critical of him and The Painter, but we'll get into that later. The point is, he does appear to genuinely want to create something valuable with the project within the slasher subgenre of analog horror, suggesting that the introduction of CSA, even if it was as shock value, was done with the intention of it serving a purpose, not just being thoughtlessly thrown in. To Urban Slug, as a huge fan of slasher flicks and gore, shock value is not senseless or meaningless, but actually something that contributes legitimate value to the project, since shock value is viewed as a positive within the slasher subgenre. In that way, I would argue that he has the right to depict CSA as the terrible thing it is, and I say that as a survivor of it myself. I think that if he takes the project seriously and it isn't just some throwaway troll garbage, then what he's doing is trying to create a piece of horror media that repulses us. And CSA is a repulsive thing that's presented in a manner that's trying to repulse us. I'm incredibly torn when it comes to judging whether or not his depiction of it in his work is inherently exploitative or not, which I suppose is because I cannot tell whether he intends it to be or not. Which brings us to the final section, the controversy surrounding Urban Slug himself. The first, that I alluded to earlier, is the manner in which he responds to criticism. On multiple occasions, his response to those who criticize his work has been to lash out at them extremely aggressively, with the maturity of a child and arguments that can be summed up as, "You just can't handle how edgy I am." Naturally, this has led to a less than favorable reputation, and while he's remedied this to a degree on both Reddit and YouTube by responding reasonably and maturely to most criticisms he's met with, his continued choice to use Twitter specifically as a platform to troll on just seems like a deeply irresponsible, detrimental move. I understand using Twitter to be less formal and more sarcastic. I do. But in my opinion, he's taken it to an unacceptable, unnecessary extreme. It's one thing to make obvious jokes. It's another thing entirely to, when you're under scrutiny for exploiting CSA by not taking it seriously in your project, call that project a comedy to troll. At that point, he can't really wonder why people think it's exploitative. Even if it's just trolling, his behavior makes it difficult to tell whether he really means it to be or not. And that's not even the worst of his Twitter behavior, because he knows people are angry about him not taking CSA seriously in his work, and he still had either the audacity or the stupidity to tweet Toy Cory plushie, yay or nay. And frankly, even if that was a joke and not an actual suggestion to sell merch of the child victim in his series, I think it's egregious either way to make light of something this legitimately serious. Even joking about that on an account used for trolling is irresponsible at best and deliberately dismissive and reductive at worst. And it's no wonder people are angry with him over it and questioning whether or not the painter is exploitative as a result. Which brings me to the final Urban Slug related controversy that is, as far as I'm concerned, objectively exploitative of CSA. He is selling merch of Cory, the child victim from the painter. Now, to be clear, he's clarified that the portrait of Cory was made long before the painter, and he was selling it on shirts long before Cory even existed and became associated with it. But as one Twitter user said well, even if it wasn't made for the series initially, it is now a part of it and is inseparable from its new context. It makes no ethical difference whether or not the shirt was being sold before the design was associated with Cory, because it is now, and he's still selling the shirt. The design on his store is even called Cory. He's selling merch of a child victim in his series either way, and now people are buying it not for the design itself, but for its association with that character, something that he's actively aware of and encouraging by naming it that. And that is literally, by definition, exploitation. And in my opinion, it's indefensible. And there we have the many controversies surrounding the painter, Urban Slug, and the debate surrounding whether or not the depiction of dark subject matter in art like this can be ethical. Did the painter go too far? Is this art that shouldn't be made? In my opinion, yes, but not because of the subject matter itself, because of how Urban Slug is presenting it. I don't believe he's wrong to depict this particular vile act in his art, because it is vile and he does present it in a way that communicates that, specifically trying to repulse us with it. But the manner in which he's presenting it suggests a severe lack of consideration and care for the enormity and seriousness of CSA's true severity. And his actions online have done little to suggest that he's taking it seriously at all. He's making jokes about it, selling merch of it, and turning a horrific act into a cash grab. There are a million ways to one-up gratuitous violence without turning to that. And if he's gonna turn to that anyway, I personally believe that he then also has a responsibility to take the series seriously and treat it as such online. And he should most definitely not ever be selling merch of the character he's subjecting to it. I think the painter presents us with a unique opportunity to reevaluate analog horror as a genre, allowing for subgenres just like those that exist within the wider realm of horror as a whole, and explore new forms of content within it, without comparing it to those that we already recognize and love. I don't think it's good even within that new potential subgenre, but I do think it was subject to unfair comparisons without being viewed as existing within it. And I think this could be a really cool turning point for the analog horror community to develop new and unique types of media and storytelling. I think the painter was an exceptionally cool concept that suffered from a lazy, uninspired execution, and was tainted by the terrible reputation gained by its creators' irresponsible, childish, and exploitative handling of it, and I'm disappointed. It could have been so much better, and Urban Slug could have handled it with so much more respect. His art is incredible, and it's sad to see that level of skill and creativity be underutilized and overly commodified to sell merch of something truly horrible. Art has the potential to take the worst of what we as humans experience and force us to look at it, acknowledge it, see it for what it is, and be repulsed by it. It takes the depravity that real people have been subjected to and forces us not to look away from the fact that that is real, and that's important. And in my opinion, that's not what the painter is doing, based largely on the creator's own apparent intentions in its handling online. And given that all Urban Slug would have to do is be reasonably responsible in his handling of it, to be even vaguely respectful and conscientious to CSA Dice survivors, and he's still not even doing that? It's disheartening on an entirely new level. I'm sure many will disagree, however, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys have to say in the comments. These are, after all, just my opinions, and so long as the debate is respectful, I think it's a very worthwhile one to have. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Cafe Soleil, Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Deverak42, King Good James, Art of Amethyst Fable, Scourge the Cat 67, and Haruki Kenway, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jamisha Walker, Alangshi, Kim Yen, Crazy Asar, Gentong, Grayson Xavier, MG, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Grim Spectre, Celine Merriman, Ash, Eldritria, The Stray Dog, Allura, Greg Noble, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Captain Reku, Catbus, Alec Ranakainen, Mac, and Lucy Yamajiki, and I'll see you in the next one.